Thank you very much, and thank you, JF Books. So that actually today is the official publication day of the book, February 12th. So it is a coincidence that it is good that to have this book event right on the day that it was published. And it is the book that I spent most time writing, that if you read it in the preface, I talk about it, it's like more than 25 years in the making, because it was my original dissertation topics about the history of sinology and sociology of knowledge and how it changed over time. But then everybody warned me that it is not, in the social science, doing intellectual history is not like a very hot topic. So you need to work on more concrete stuff like protests or economy, political economy, development. So I take the advice and I moved to work on Chinese protests in the Qing dynasty and all the way to the 20th century. That became my dissertation, and later I moved on to work on the political economy of development of China, and the more recently, political economy of U.S.-China relation, the protests and crackdown in Hong Kong and such. But at the same time, I'm continue to collect materials and work on this book in the background. And then now it is out in 2026. I can't be happier because it is a much more timely kind of a publication than if I have finished it and published it like 20 years ago. Because just this past year, we see this big swing of the perception of China right in front of our eyes. We see it swing 5 to 10 years before. Like in the early 2000s, everybody is saying that China is the model of capitalism. And in the beginning of the book, I have a quote from Donald Trump in 2008. And then he literally said that because at that time he was not serious in politics. He's just like a real estate developer, and he was speaking to a hospitality conference, like this hotel chain conference about real estate development in New York City. And then he told the audience at the time, 2008, that, oh, I just came back from Shanghai. I see all these people building stuff. They throwing dirt and tons of dirt into the river. Very convenient. And I asked the guy whether you need environmental assessment, impact assessment. And the guy said, what are you talking about? I don't know what you're talking about. And then Donald Trump said, oh, it is the way to do business. It is real capitalism. While in the US, we are all strangled by regulations and all this government intervention. In Hudson River, he said that if I throw a stone into the river, that I will get an electric chair. He's exaggerating. So it is the perception. Not only him, but at that time in 2000, particularly right after the global financial crisis, there's all this talk about, China is doing finance much better than the US and anybody else. And so China is the kind of a model of free market. We no longer have free market because we have environmentalism, regulation, socialism, more and all. So that was the 2008, 9, 10, around that time. We have this very well-known book, still a kind of bestseller book today. It's that When China Ruled the World, who talk about that China becoming a new model of doing business and even governing the world and so on and so forth. And then around 2015, 2016, we know what happened, that the view turned negative. Talking about Calvin Rudd, who used to be he's actually a sinologist. He's an interesting fellow. He was trained in the Australian National University and then became the prime minister and had no fluent Chinese, and recently, I think he's no longer the Australian ambassador to the US, no longer. That's the most recent. So he's a kind of a China hand, so now I think he's in his Asia policy, the Asian Society, the Asian policy body there to do research. And then when he was prime minister, he of course that have a very good relation, building good relation between Australia and China, and saying a lot of positive things about China. But then in recent years, he's right about the kind of authoritarian model in Chinese capitalism is strangling innovation and so on and so forth. So we have this big shift. But then in the last few months, not even last year, we see another shift of perception, not because anything changed in China, that what has been set in motion about the overcapacity, involution, and the crackdown on wealthy people in the name of crackdown on corruption and everything is the trend is all the same. But then over the last few months, we suddenly see a lot of journalistic article and even some scholarly article talking about, China is winning the nuclear war with US, China is doing everything better. And even the Democratic Party side, and you must have heard about the book Abundance by Ursula Klein and Derek Thompson. So basically the book is saying similar thing that Donald Trump talked about in 2008. That is, China is doing much better in everything because they build and build and build without regarding anything. And then US is having a housing affordability crisis because of too much regulation, environmental concern, and things like that. So they are actually advocating the Democrats to be like adopting this growth policy to build high-speed rail. We are so slow. We are talking about all this kind of social impact, environmental impact, and things like. We just take out the regulation and build like China. So the underpinning conception is that U.S. is having all the problem because we are not like China. We should be more like China. And then and it is very interesting because of course, that book has been around for a long while, but then in the last few months, you can see a lot of journalistic articles talking about China is winning the AI, winning EV, winning everything. Suddenly, of course, that I can go on that this model is that you have a champion of EV, BYD, but at the same time, you have dozens, if not hundreds, of other EV makers going under the water, and the profit margin is not very good, and then it's not creating a lot of jobs, and a lot of these kind of companies go bust. And then we have one very, very super competitive survivor and champion, that is BYD. So it is, and even Donald Trump, a few months ago when he talked about changing the regulation of publicly traded company reporting to change from semi-annual report of the company profit and earning and all that information to the market to annual report. And then he has a social media post saying that it is a way to go that having a report every 6 months and encourage short-term behavior, and then we should let them report longer spacing in 1 year. So that is fine. I agree that is good. But then in the social media post and in Truth Social, he adds something. Look at the Chinese company. They have a horizon of 50 to 100 years. They say. So they always think about long term. So it's why U.S. is going under. We are only thinking about short term. But of course, that is nonsense. You ask Evergrande whether they have 50 or 100 years vision when they are building all these real estate development or even every company that they just how it works, that they just borrow money from the state bank to build the stuff. You worry about whether there are people buying it later, and then many of them actually didn't become profitable and then couldn't repay and then go under Evergrande. Now we all know that all real estate. So it is. But this is this conception that all of a sudden China become the sage that always think about the long term, very rational. So this swing is very drastic. From extreme to extreme, and many times it is not driven by anything changing in China, but driven by change in the U.S. or in the West. Obviously, now with the new administration, it's still a new administration. It's just a little bit longer than 1 year, but it feels like 10 years already. That is a long 1 year we have. But then everybody have issue with the administration, or whoever having issues with the administration in U.S. or in the West, they tend to find a kind of a perfect mirror to measure U.S. against, and saying that U.S. is much worse than that perfect example. Then that perfect example suddenly become China. Even though, again, that from 2025 and 2026 and 2024, 2023, that dynamics of Chinese political economy didn't change fundamentally, but the perception suddenly changed. And of course, you look at Canada, many European commentators, and sometimes I don't want to name any of them, but then sometimes you can see this kind of talk about how U.S. should learn from the China industrial policy and green transition policy and everything. That you can tell that they are painting a rosy picture, rosier than even the Chinese government propaganda. Even Chinese government acknowledge that there's a problem of overcapacity, involution is not the term they use. It is like more kind of a civil society term. But then the Chinese government did talk about this problem. But then we will see these people, many of them are in DC think tank circuits, some of them are in UK, and they will keep saying that like we should learn from China, we are very bad, and all about China model is only positive. And of course, then the Chinese political economy is very different from the US, and then they can afford pushing for EV, having dozens of EV going under, or when they do kind of a solar panel and making it very cheap, and then there's a lot of subsidies, government subsidies, of course. But at the same time, there's a lot of companies that make solar panel didn't make ends meet, and in the end they go bust. But in the Chinese system that you can tolerate, big extent kind of bankruptcy or a company go bust. But in the US, that you have government support of one company, and then if it go bust, that is the Obama era. There's a kind of a solar panel company that actually went bust. And then we are still talking about it today. That's seeing how wasteful it is. And there's one company that get the government subsidies and then went bust. So in the Chinese system, it's very different environment. And of course, then the more recent talk is a lot of people talking about actually the book itself is very more nuanced and complicated than how people appropriate the book argument and then try to make an argument. That is one down book about the brick left. It's about this engineer versus lawyers, and again, the book did talk about the problem of the China model and all of this. It's more complicated, but then in the media pick it up that they only draw the conclusion that actually, of course, the U.S. or the West itself is very problematic and everything is not as competitive than China because we are too contentious. We have too many lawyers and suing one another, while China have run by engineers. So they have like very single-mindedly doing something that they always get it done very efficiently. Of course, that is true that overall you can tell the difference between the kind of engineering mindset and a more legalistic mindset. But then the problem, I don't have a problem with this contrast. In many ways it is true. My problem is how people project it as a kind of a Chinese-Western difference. Because you look back in history of the US in the 19th century, early 20th century, US has a lot of engineers. If not, then how can U.S. build the Panama Canal and Hoover Dam and all the railroad and design and invent the Model T? So is the 19th century, early 20th century, Germany, Japan, and so basically that's different between like engineering culture or more regulatory lawyer culture. Is more like a difference between a kind of a established, mature, advanced economy and a kind of a upcoming, like latecomer developing society, rapidly developing society. So it is a different stage of development. But then now the discussion become a kind of a East-West difference, or the American difference as if it is a perennial difference. It's never changed, but actually it will change. And I can foresee that when China continue to move up the ladder, that when there's more innovation and people want to protect the intellectual property, in the end, I can't tell how fast it is. China will become more regulatory and legalistic, no doubt about it. So basically, there's this kind of a conception but that's still like haunting us in all the discussion. And then in the book, and I trace back to this kind of a big swing between very positive to very negative view to history, and then you can trace it back all the way to Marco Polo or pre-Marco Polo time, and it is very much in a religious mindset in the Catholic Church and later in the Protestantism. So it is one main theme of the book. The other main theme of the book is that to try to have a critical dialogue with Edward Said, of course, that everybody talk about Orientalism and Western conception of the East. They talk about Edward Said. I have no problem with Edward Said, the book Orientalism, that because it's very specific about how the West perceive the Middle East, Arab countries, Muslim country, but it's very specific because Muslim countries, the Arab world has a very special relation with the West because it is very conflictual. From you know all the history, from Crusade to the Ottoman Empire to recent history, while China Japan is an interesting contrast, but I don't have space to deal with it, but then I can talk about it later a little bit. That is China is so far away, and then the West has not had direct conflictual relation with China until very late in the 19th century, early 20th century, have this direct connection. So it created a kind of a huge space of fantasy. In the Western conception of the Middle East, and Edward Said will talk about all this kind of negativity, and if it is anything positive, it is mostly, as illustrated in one of the editions of the Edward Said books, cover, that is this very sexualized and feminized, and so it is a fantasy. But in China, there's a much bigger room for fantasy about all kinds of things, from the biblical scholarship about actually that this idea, we talk about it today, people laugh, but then all until the late 19th century, it is a very standard knowledge among the Christian community. They all think that, most if not all, that actually Confucius was an Asian Christian, that he got all the things from God. So it is what they believe, and the more famous theories, of course, from the Jesuits. We know all this Jesuits translation of Confucius, and so this is why they claim in the Confucius text, in a number of time, it mentions Shangdi is like equivalent to God, and Ten is equivalent to our conception of heaven. So the Jesuits is very famous for saying that actually Confucius got all the morality from God. Actually, that's so. Religion and administration, for example, for Tyre, it is also very famous, or infamously, right, that in the 1730s and 1740s, saying that if Europeans want to learn what human right is, and look at China. China is the place where human right was very well protected, that human dignity was much more upheld compared to Europe at the time. But you know the history of Yongjing and all that, you know it is not the case nowadays, but then back then it is really conception, very common. And the physiocrats, like Quanet, who is the predecessor of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nation in the 18th century in France, that they always say that if you want to find an example of laissez-faire free market economy, you look at China. That is the 18th century China, because they have such a big empire, and seemingly the emperor actually didn't intervene in the economy, so it is all free trade and free market. But now, of course, I look at, I research on Chang's socio-economic history for a long time, but now that we all very much know that, and actually I spent a lot of time in the first historical archive in Beijing when it was still open. Now it is like more difficult to access. I look at all this Secret Palace memorial, the communication between the emperor to the local officials from Yongjing to all the way to Qianlong and to Jiaqing time. You know that it is not free market. The emperor, one of the most frequently discussed topics is the price of grain and price. And then the local government keep reporting, and then the emperor still keep instructing how they intervene in the market to keep the price low, and it is too low, then how to raise it up. And then so it is very regulated. It's not exactly free market as the physiocrat fantasized back in the 18th century. So there's a lot of this kind of fantasy, and of course then so when you look at previous works about Western conception of China, they adopt the Edward Said model, saying that, oh, there's so many people saying stupid, bad thing about China. So the solution is to say some stupid good thing about China. So, but then the thing is that what we see is that in the Western conception of China, there's a radical swing between saying stupid bad thing about China and stupid good thing about China. And actually, I'm not kidding. There's a book by a very respectable German historian. I think it's called The Unfabling the East. So he argued that in the 16th, 17th century, the Western mind is more respectful to the East and talk about China, India, the Persian area, and then think that they are fabling the East and establish them as fable. And he think that it is a good thing. And imperialism came, and then the West start to unfable the East, and so it is a bad thing. So and take off the kind of fantasy, so it's a bad thing. So and in the very end of the book, he actually advocates refabling the East. That is actually is good, and so it is a very bad idea, because one argument of the book is that this very radical fantasy about China and a very radical negative fear about China actually is like the same two sides of the same coin, and it is all based on a very simplistic and reifying view about China. One example is that I caught that two very much a founding father of modern sinology in the 19th century, one in Oxford, James Lack. That is quite well known because James Lack in the 19th century worked with Wang Tao, which is a late Qing reformer in colonial Hong Kong, and translate all the classic texts of Confucius and the Taoist texts. And we are still using those texts actually. That is good translation. But then there's a kind of a preface notes in the translation and also commentary. It's very interesting because as I said, that this Western view on China from negative to positive changed radically without taking into consideration what actually happening in China. The James Lack is an important example in the 19th century because in the late 18th century, during the radical phase of Enlightenment, you see all this quote from Hegel to Kant to Rousseau. They talk about China. They always talk about this negativity, which is a big shift from the early Enlightenment from Voltaire and all the Jesuits writing. But in the 19th century, mid-19th century, suddenly, the writing about China become positive again. And James Lack is one of the good example, early James Lack, because later on he changed his view. But then in the mid-19th century, after the Opium War, it is very obvious that China and the Qing Empire was falling apart. But then James Lack was talking about reviving all these Jesuits' fantasy about that actually the ancient Chinese believe in a monotheistic God. So this whole text of Confucius, you should read it because it is directly from the God original morality. To learn about gods, just like what the Jesuits were saying in the 17th and 18th century, we need to learn from the Confucius text to have a close proximity to God original morality. And then the background is that James Lack was part of the, he was important because he was the first sinology in Oxford University, modern founder of sinology in the UK and Europe at large. And then he has a missionary background. He was a missionary from Scotland in the Presbyterian Church. Always think that because Confucius was an Asian Christian, and then the actual knowledge about God and then the Trinity and everything lost over history, but then the core of the morality is still intact. So it is, he's saying that so it is actually very easy to convert all Chinese to Christianity because it is so compatible with their morality. His view is not unique about China because at the same time, the guy who get him to Oxford to teach Chinese and China was a kind of Indologist, Frederick Max Muller. He's very well known in studying the Sanskrit ancient Hindu text, and he created this theory about the Indo-European language and Aryan race and Aryan culture, thinking that actually that the European culture originated from the Aryan culture in South Asia, but later the darker race people from the north invade, and then some of them original Aryan people migrate to Europe, became the origin of the European civilization. So that the premise is that these people are unhappy about modernization, industrialism, materialism, atheism that came with modernity in the 19th century Europe. They think that there's something wrong with Europe, that we are becoming too materialistic. We are losing our spiritual morality and spirituality and everything. So we need to look east to find this lost piece of spirituality and morality. Because these people are actually that they're still practicing the ancient morality that they directly got from God. And of course, there's a linguistic movement as well. That and of course now that Noam Chomsky is in the news nowadays for the like bad reason, but he has this idea about universal language, and actually this kind of a theory of universal language originates from actually James Lack and his generation of sinology talk about it, and then the Jesuits talk about it, and saying that actually, because it's all come from Bible in the end, that because in Bible everybody speak God language, and then after Noahic flood, and then there's Tower of Babel, and then the God think that the humans are so bad in trying to build a tower that high reaching the heaven, so they penalize them by creating the confusion of tongues and create the plurality of language. so that people cannot like communicate well enough to like cooperate to build that tower. So it is the Bible story, but then in the 16th, 17th century, there is a kind of a movement within the Catholic Church and among these linguists, and thinking that actually there was used to have a universal language of human being that enable human being to communicate with one another transparently, without misunderstanding. And people are looking for this universal language and original, what they call lingua adamica. That is the language spoken by Adam, the first human. There's a God language. The theory is that if you found this language, then we can have transparent knowledge about God and morality, and everything will be fine. And then the Jesuits is preaching the theory that actually Chinese is that language. Because at that time, people calculate the chronology of Bible and think that the world is about like 5,000, 6,000 years old. Because they read the Bible literally from Genesis to all the Exodus, and they count the generations. And they think that the world is about 6,000 years old. And then Noah's flood happened about 2,500 years ago, BC, and then the Tower of Babel happened, and then so it is the very now nobody, like, people laugh at it, but then people really believe in it at that time. And then they look at the Chinese written history and then the continuity of the Chinese language. They think there's about 2,500 years. So they develop a theory that the Chinese must be the kind of lingua adamica. Probably they are too far away. The Chinese didn't go to construct the Tower of Babel. So they successfully avoid the confusion of tongue. So the Chinese are still speaking the God language. So it is what Jesus is talking about. And in the 19th century, a lot of sinology think that like the Chinese language is actually a purer language of the original form, closer to the original universal human language. That later branch out into different language and corrupt and become incommunicable with one another. So it is the idea that in the 19th century, China is obviously falling apart, and then the Qing Empire was falling apart, but then the kind of modernization, industrialism, the rise of materialism and atheism, and later, of course, the Darwinian worldview threatened many religious people, and then they really want to tell people that actually that we should look to somewhere else to find the lost spirituality and the lost morality, and China is the solution. And let's learn from China, and then let's look at Chinese text. So it is this kind of a idea that China has been doing things, principle the same with the West, but actually even doing better than the West. So in the 19th century, they're talking about morality, God's morality, even God's language. And then of course James Lake himself changed his view in the late 19th century, and he became very racist and talking about, suddenly turned very, very negative about China. Everything he wrote about China is that, oh, that's Confucius didn't teach Chinese anything. They teach them to be like not doing anything, just like laying flat and not innovating anything and things like that. So all of a sudden it changed, but it's a long story how it changed. But then again, this change has nothing to do with what is actually happening in China. That in the mid to late 19th century, the trend is very clear. But then it is also only fulfilling the lead of the West at the time. And it continued into the 20th century. It's very interesting that I look at how the nationalist government, the Kuomintang, the Chiang Kai-shek, portray himself to the West. And so there is this kind of in the 1920s, 1930s, and after Chiang Kai-shek managed to claim to unify China, actually you know that there is this warlord, and it's not quite centralized as much as it claimed. But then from a Chinese audience, from a Chinese perspective, you don't associate Chiang Kai-shek as a Christian. He is a Christian, of course. We know that he baptized when he married into the Song family, and because of this kind of a marriage of convenience, and the Song family is a powerful family at the time, and they're Christian. So everybody knows that he's not a serious Christian. When the war, the Second World War is starting, not even starting, but before that, when China, Japan going into conflict, and then later the Kuomintang is having a conflict with the communists. From the 1930s all the way to the 1940s, and the strategy of Chiang Kai-shek and of course Song Mi-ling is to go to the U.S. and then you look at all these kind of a portrayal of Chiang Kai-shek. They all emphasize that Chiang Kai-shek is a Christian. And you know that in the early 20th century, all the China hand in U.S. they have a kind of a Christian missionary background, like Henry Luce, and of course Pearl Buck. Pearl Buck is the author of the Good Earth, who became a Nobel Prize winner, and then she became a very important figure to persuade the FDR government to continue the support, unwavering support to the Chiang Kai-shek. And then you look at the writing, they keep emphasizing that China was actually the evils and the Maoists all Christians. And then the pro-Belt right wrote the Good Earth, and then you look at the speech that she gave to different places in the high class society to talk about Good Earth and things like that. I think that, Good Earth is a happen that can happen in Midwest US. We are sharing the same efforts. It's like self-made man and then like farming and have a good family, have some coral and things like that. So they are basically saying that they're all, in the heart, they are good Christian. And then, so it is a missionary agenda there. So actually they might be practicing God's morality better than us. We are already like strangled by this atheism, then materialism, industrialism. So it is like the New Age kind of thing, that thinking that we lost the spirituality, go east to recover our spirituality. But then they are speaking in this Christian kind of a language. And more interestingly, that Chiang Kai-shek, during the war, that he published a book, 中国的命运, just like the fate of China. So it is written by right-wing historian in China, Tao Xixing, but the author is Chiang Kai-shek. It's very interesting that the Chiang Kai-shek and the people surrounding him have taken great effort to prevent the book from being translated into English. And then the establishment, the FDR government know that, and then they also participate in this kind of, it is in this book that they have an active effort to prevent the book from being translated into English. And then people, including John King Fairbank, who read Chinese and read the book, is actually angry, feeling betrayed, because it's like fascist stuff, it's Nazi. Because he's talking about China by essence is a communal society. We are sticking together, we all obey to our leader. It is why we have a great civilization. But now since the 19th century, this decadent Western liberalism came, erode our strength. So now people no longer listen to our great leader and no longer stick together. And then if things go on like that, and actually they have a paragraph to critique Rousseau and all this Western liberalism and saying that all the root of the Chinese problem today is all this Western bad influence. We need to get rid of it. If we don't get rid of it, and then in the book, literally he said that all Chinese will become gypsy. You know gypsy? They get despised all over Europe, and then if we don't, we continue to listen to this kind of a liberalism thing, we are all becoming gypsy. At the time in the US, they all know that it's like what they try to support, because they are selling Song Meiling and all these people are selling in Washington Chiang Kai-shek as a kind of a good liberal Christians. And then in this speech of these people, they keep saying that that alliance between the US and China will lead to the most populous Christian nation on earth on the US side, which is China. So they all expect China to become a great Christian liberal nation like the US if they support Chiang Kai-shek good enough. And then at that time that they have a translated copy internally circulating translated by the OSS, which is the predecessor of the CIA, that they have a restricted copy to circulate among the government. And some congressmen actually read it and then getting angry again and then calling for the book to be translated to the English, and so that we know what actually our government is supporting. And then there was the late after the war, that is like 46, 47. Of course, we know that John King Fairbank is very critical of the Kuomintang regime, and some other U.S., not necessarily in the left, some liberal think that actually Chiang Kai-shek is actually a lot as good as we think he is. And then if we don't look for alternative, then actually that the Republic of China will lose to the Soviet Union. So they and one Congress in the House of Representatives, Delaney, they called it even give a speech and then urge the government to translate the whole book to make the public know about the agenda of Chiang Kai-shek, and he called the book "The Fate of China" the Mein Kampf of China. So basically, he recognized that the Chiang Kai-shek regime is very much having a Nazi kind of ideology. So, but then you know that they know that this kind of Western fantasy about its Christian China that is actually practicing Christian morality better than the West is very like deep-seated. So they know about it. I call it self-orientalism of the Chiang Kai-shek regime, and to gather Western support by telling what they really are believing in, and then to present themselves as a good Christian liberals. And then today, that of course we no longer talk about China and think about China in this religious term, but we can still see the parallel. Like like the conception that China is doing the same thing as us, but doing better than us. But then in the height of neoliberalism and globalization, that this Christianity is replaced by neoliberalism and free market. And people who know the Chinese political economy, we know that China is never a free market, even in the reform era. When Deng Xiaoping started reform, and then they deliberately add the kind of a clause in the 1980s, I think it's the 1982 version of the Constitution, that is like the land property is only state-owned. And the state sector should be the dominating sector in the economy. So in the past, that in Mao, of course, it is all true. There's no private property of land. The state sector definitely is dominated, but it's not like as a constitutional guarantee level. It's in practice, you know that. But then in 82, when they start the free market reform, and then they worry that it becomes too much free market, so they instate this kind of constitutional tenets in the constitution to make sure that it is state dominated. And then we all know that even Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji era, the state never go away. It's like never free market. But then you look at the discourse in the 1990s and 2000s when talking about China free market, and there's a lot of talk about like China is actually doing free market and much better than the U.S. And then after the financial crisis, definitely one of the former like undersecretary of Treasury even write a book saying that like China really know how to put their books in order, and then their finance, their banking is much stronger than the U.S. banking. So U.S. should learn from China in banking. So today, of course, with all these non-performing loans and all these debt issues, and we know that China has a lot of problem in the financial sector. So, but then it is the idea that has this kind of a religious parallel or even root, that is China is a far away, and so not many people are knowing about and know the language and history and everything, so that it is create a space for people to fantasize that China is doing what we are doing but better than us, so we should have better learn from it. And I can trace it back all the way to so it's 800 years. It's not an exaggeration. That, by the way, that my original idea of the book is 800 years of bullshit about China. But then I think that there's no way that the publisher will accept this title. And but later on, David Garber, which is like a very well-known, though he died very young, anthropologist, written a book posthumously that's published after he died. It's just called Bullshit, and so it's now acceptable to have a book title with bullshit on it. So next time I will try. But 800 years is not an exaggeration, because I start with Marco Polo, even before Marco Polo. Again, that's an interesting side point of the book is that all the way to early 20th century, that the racial category of Mongoloid is a predecessor of the category of yellow, the yellow race. That they call everybody from East Asia as Mongol, Korean, Japanese, and Chinese, and then in the late 19th century, when the U.S. started to have this China Exclusion Act, and then young Theodore Roosevelt, long before he got into politics, but he wrote an article saying that, like, of course we have to anti-China Exclusion Act because we are facing a Mongol invasion now, and we need to get rid of the Mongols. It's a threat to Western civilization. So this Mongol is a kind of a term that they used to refer to, later they used the term to refer to Japanese and all East Asians. So it is basically a kind of a predecessor of the concept of yellow. So it's interesting, then the medieval conception of the Mongol Empire became very important. It continued all the way to contemporary geopolitical imagination. Like in the beginning of the Cold War, when China became communist and Soviet Union and communist, of course, that day, there's a one U.S. General that is early, so that he actually warned about Soviet Union, warned about China become communist, even before the Cold War officially started. And then I quote in the book that he basically said that this communism would be like a Mongol Empire, Neo-Mongol invasion. So because this whole Eurasian landmass, when they unified in one like dictatorship, that it would be very fearful. They will invade the fringe, maritime fringe of this Eurasia, including Japan and Europe. Definitely, is oceanic relations. So this like imagination of a unified Mongol empire and Mongol invasion is always there. And even like today, I can find a lot of examples talking about like Russia, Iran, and China is like sticking together, become a bloc. And then this kind of I don't have it in the book, but if I have a PowerPoint, I will show it. That is a Wall Street Journal article with the kind of a picture is like Putin dressing as Genghis Khan. With like a horde of Mongol armies like invading West. So basically this is the idea, is the imagination. But then there's a kind of shift, and Marco Polo is famous not because of his description or his claim that he is the first one to actually directly travel to the China region of the Mongol Empire. Many people doubt whether he actually traveled there. I think he did travel there. If you actually read the book, you look at the description of the funeral customs and everything. This is quite accurate. Though historians will argue that actually the rosy picture about the Mongol to Kublai Khan probably is not right, because Marco Polo was in Beijing in the 1270s and mostly 1280s, when after the failed invasion of Japan, the Mongol Empire is already running down. The government has a lot of corruption and problem. So it's not as benign as before. So that is this kind of a discrepancy some historians argue. But the most important thing that people miss in the Marco Polo and why it was so popular is that Marco Polo in the book, I'm sure that he's like bullshitting, because he claimed in the book that I talked to Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan told me he is ready to convert to Christianity, and then he told Marco Polo said that Kublai Khan just told me to get some like Catholic priests to let me bring them to the Kublai Khan to help convince his noblemen, and then the whole Mongol Empire will become a Christian empire. So it is why this fantasy about like having a huge Christian powerful empire on the East, in the East, that is like this, create this kind of a fantasy, because at that time in the after the Crusade, and the Ottoman Empire hasn't risen yet, but then they constantly facing the threat from the Muslim world. They always imagine that if we have a Christian forces in the Far East, so we can crush the Muslim world from both the East and the West, and then Christianity will triumph in the whole world, the whole known world, that is Eurasia at the time, that it didn't include the Americas, not yet discovered. So it is this fantasy about this kind of a Eastern Christian. And then because at that time it's not only Marco Polo is saying that there is a kind of the powerful force in the East waiting to be converted and help the West a lot. Because at that time the church is debating the origin of the Mongol. And at that time, all the way to 17th, 18th century, they use the word interchangeably. Mongols, Tatar, Chinese, and the Cathay. So there's all interchangeable term. So in the 13th century, in the church, there's a debate about the origin of these people far away, far in the East. There's two competing theory that become the archetype of this kind of extreme fear and extreme fantasy about China. The extreme fear part is that there's one theory is that the Chinese or the Mongols at that time, they don't have the term Chinese. All these people in the Far East, they originate from the lost tribe of Israel. If you know the Bible, you know that is when Moses led the Israeli people out of the slavery in Egypt, and then received the Ten Commandments, and we have a monotheistic God. And then some Jewish people that they hold on to the golden bull and all these idols and refuse to believe in a monotheistic God, and they left. So it became the lost tribes of Israel. There's no account about where did they go. They may have gone east. So that the theory is that they are the lost tribe of Israel. They are idol worshipper and satanic. So they are origin. So they are enemy of the Christians. So it was very popular theory when there was a kind of threat of Mongol invasion in the 1240s. When they go all the way to they already invaded Poland and raided today's Ukraine, and go all the way to the vicinity of today's Vienna, but then turn back. And historians are still debating why they turned back and didn't invade. But when they won, they could have invaded. So at that time it was a panic. So that is all this theory about this kind of a lost tribe of Israel, satanic and idol worshipping people is coming to destroy Christianity, and there's some anti-Semitism going on because they think that this like the Jewish people within the city will collaborate with them and crush Christianity from without and from above. So it is crazy stuff. But then after the Mongol invasion threat receded, and then there's start to have this kind of idea about that maybe these people, in the end, they haven't invaded Europe, but there's a news about they are invading a lot of cities in the Arab lands and Muslim world and things like that. So they might be allies in our European conflict with the Muslim world. And then so this developed an alternative theory about the origins of the Mongols or the Chinese or all the people from the Far East. They think that they are the descendants of the three Magis. The three Magis is the three wise men, you know, in Bible that who visit baby Jesus. Pay tribute and recognize him as the Messiah, and then left, go back to the East. And then after that, the Bible didn't say where did they go. And then now the theory is that they are the origin of the Chinese and the Mongols. So it fit into this kind of a creative fantasy about they are actually Christian. Maybe they lost the actual knowledge about God and Jesus, crucifixion. They don't know about it, but then they get the knowledge and moral system and the social system directly from God. So actually, they're good people, potential allies. So this kind of archetype of this kind of a fantasy or extreme fear, all the way to the 19th century, have this kind of a religious twist in it. All the way in the early 20th century, as you see, the FDR administration and all these U.S.-China hands, they have most of them, if not all, have this missionary background, and as opposed to, and because they are very frustrated in many other Asian societies, particularly Japan, that with the imperial system and Shintoism, the missionary work is not doing a lot headway, converting a lot of people, while in China they seem to have been doing a better jobs and things like that. So, and a lot of Christian missionaries and doing trade as well with China, they became powerful and influential in Washington, China lobby at the time. So they all see this kind of a Christian lens. And then again, that this kind of a religious underpinning fade out when we no longer see this relation in a kind of a religious term, but then it is a substitute, as I said, in the 1980s and 1990s when Deng Xiaoping came along and then market reform and things like that. We all fantasize that China is actually doing real free market capitalism, maybe even better than US, and basically that when in the UK is interesting, another quote that he's less famous in here, like Lord Sugar. He's the host of the UK version of Appendix. In like the mid 2010s, there's a radical left, Jeremy Corbyn in Labour Party has a chance to get elected, and he openly say that okay, with Jeremy Corbyn and Labour Party under his leadership become the UK government, we all live and move to China. Because it's where the real capitalism is, and UK will become no longer capitalism. So it's all this fantasy. That is all like when in the 19th century, European Christian communities kind of feeling threatened by materialism, industrialism, modernity. They all look to China, mostly China actually, that as a kind of a refuge of what they have been losing in Europe. At that time, it was Christianity, God's morality, and spirituality. And in more contemporary world, it is this free market and things like that. So it is the major impetus of the book, that I have a lot of things to say that I don't have time to talk about, but I'm happy to take questions and comments, and we can have a conversation about all these issues that I touch upon. But thank you for your patience, and thank you for coming.
My question is around the key point you have been emphasizing, which is a shift of Western perception doesn't really have anything to do with what happened in China.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to grasp is what is the implication behind, like, do you think it's the dynamic going to continue? And there, if want to prevent this dynamic, which is to help Western stay in the middle, more neutral rather than going extreme, what we need to do? Thank you.
As the political and journalistic and popular discourse about China is, I said, is always fascinating. It's not I said. I quote Jeff Wasserstrom has a long time ago has a very interesting article saying that this Manchu fool versus the good earth. That is like good earth is like good farmers and low control and self-made man. And the Manchu fool, you know that we still see it. Like Iron Man has this character, but then with a twist later on. This Manchu fool is like the Manchu Mandarin, so it is a very popular lawful, saying that all this kind of Mandarin Fu Manchu, that he's like building an underground empire, so it's a yellow period personification, and then invade and subvert the West. And so it is always resonating in these two image. And one of the arguments in the book is that actually this kind of image vaccination is not only in politics and in popular discourse, and also in academic discourse as well. I talk about James Leck and all these early sinologies, but then it changed in academia, that in academic discussion of China is, we already surpassed it. That the thing is not that we are saying stupid good thing about China or stupid bad thing about China, but actually it is like the stupidities matter, whether it is not good or bad. Because in China, as in all other countries and society, they are both good and bad. Whatever moral yardstick you are using to measure. So it is the complication and the nuance that we need to uphold. About, as I said in my method class, about like comparing like different countries or differences of civilization, we tend to have this idea about, China has West, China has X, and Europe has Y, so there's a different development. Or but then people argue that, China has X and Europe also has X too, and then Europe has Y and China has Y too. So it is this kind of a simplistic contrast lead to go that we in all society, and so both China and Europe has both X and Y. It is the relation and the ways and the relative balance of force between this X and Y that create a difference. One example is that this simplistic view is overcome in academia in recent decades. But then we have a threat that actually it is why I think that this book is not going to be translated into mainland China. If they translate it, they will cut out a lot of things at the very end. Because I talk about this, I not only talk about how Chiang Kai-shek using this self-orientalism and pay into this Western fantasy about China to advance their interests. And now this is what the Chinese government has been doing. I have a lot of examples, for example, that went during the zero COVID, when China and many other people in the West is praising the China way to control the pandemic, and Western is like so chaotic, so it's a failure, and China is doing much better in controlling the pandemic. And then at that time, Global Times and all the Chinese official media is justifying civil COVID in a civilizational term, saying that, we Asian people or Chinese people doing much better in listening to order. And we listen to order because we know the leader is for the common good. So we can give up our self-interest to listen to the leader for the common good is why we can control the, so when the government so locked down, don't go anywhere, we just like totally obey, never question. So it is why we have done such a good job compared to the like individualistic liberal West that is like basically failing. So we have all this, and then you can see this kind of discourse about like just like Chiang Kai-shek, all the way to all authoritarian, including the before democratization, the Kuomintang government in Taiwan, and then also the right-wing dictatorship in South Korea. They're all emphasizing it. These Asian values and communalism, collectivism, there's all good. Is why we are doing so well, better than the West, until that problem happened, or until that the system change is still doing well. This is very ironic that like, for example, Korea and Taiwan back in the 60s and 70s is in the literature is the poster child of this Confucianist authoritarian capitalism that a lot of people write about how well they are, how better they are compared to Western capitalism. But in the end, that they're still doing very well economically, but they democratize, and you look at the Freedom House Index about the ranking, that they are much higher than many old democracies in the West. And so we need to uphold the nuance and the complexity in our understanding of China that has always have a constant temptation that we just like simplify things in a way that, because China is so big that it is easy to simplify. You see this thing and then think that generalize it to the whole China or whatever. So it is easier said than done. Then this kind of temptation of simplification is always there, particularly in like the Chinese authorities, just as all kind of authoritarian regime before the current Chinese government in other part of East Asia has been doing. And then this simplistic thing always lead to very bad policy and bad prediction, because they look at Hegel and Kant and even Marx when they talk about Oriental despotism. They use India as a prime example, because the whole concept, the origin of the concept is from the British Parliament report about India in the early 19th century because they want to centralize taxation and things, so they create this idea about this like isolated self-governing village, not organizing horizontally, not having any connection. So see this, all this sack of potatoes image come from, originally from this British portrayal of India. So it's why India is so easy to rule by outsider. First the Mughal Empire and then the British Empire. So when Hegel and Kant is talking about the Oriental despotism, and later on this like political philosophers saying India is the country that is most hopeless about democracy. China might be better, have a better hope of democracy because the Oriental despotism is less gripping. But in the end, that you see that this opposite happened. In India, of course, that like have all the problem, but all democracy has this problem, is the long-lasting kind of democracy surviving the threat of fascism in the 70s during the emergency, and now it's still having problem, but also has a kind of a functioning democracy, while China is far from it. So this kind of a simplistic idea is easy to construct, is tempting, and then particularly if you construct it and you fulfill certain vested interests in the Western establishment. But we try our best to avoid it, and I'm telling my academic colleagues then uphold this kind of a complex view, don't be kind of too much tempted by this kind of a simplifying urge from either Western establishment elite or Chinese government. Thank you, everyone.